Over the last couple of years, there has been lots in the media about high interest rates increasing the cost of home ownership, and at the same time we've seen rising rental costs for renters, with landlords passing through their increased costs. So in today's economic climate, what is the best financial option? To buy or to rent? In this video, we're going to look at the factors to consider in a typical buy versus rent situation, and hopefully by the end of the video, it will help you to make a more informed decision. If you're new to this channel, I'm Matt. I've been a finance consultant for over 10 years. I now run my own company, and on this channel I talk all things personal finance. So let's get going with the video and start by looking at the financial considerations of the two options. To compare apples with apples, I found a 3-bed new build house in the city of Manchester in the UK valued at £350,000. And in a similar area of Manchester, I found a 3-bed new build property to rent for £1,650 per calendar month. As both properties are new builds and in central Manchester, the property value and rent prices are slightly higher than average, but it provides a good example to base the comparison on. I'm going to exclude costs such as utility bills or council tax, as these are excluded in both the buying and renting calculations. If we start with considering the cost of renting the property, let's assume that we rented for 5 years and the average annual inflation over that period is 3%. That means towards the end of the 5-year rental agreement, you would have gone from paying £1,650 per month at the start to paying over £1,900 per month towards the end, giving an average inflation adjusted rate of £1,781 per month. On top of this, you're typically required to pay a deposit equal to 1 month of your rent, which is returned to you at the end of your rental agreement. This is subject to no deductions being taken for things like repairs to any damages on the property above general wear and tear. Rent costs are fairly straightforward, whereas when comparing this to home ownership and buying a property, there are a number of different costs to consider. There are 4 main costs. Let's start with the deposit on the property. Typically for a first-time buyer or someone who's moving from a starter home to their first family home, the deposit amount is around 10 to 20% of the property value. If we take the midpoint and put down a 15% deposit on a £350,000 property, that means the down payment would be £52,500, which is a significant amount of money to be able to save up, even if you're buying as a couple with 2 incomes and savings. The next cost to consider is the mortgage cost. If a 15% deposit is made, that means taking out a mortgage and loan for 85% of the property value. There are various options for mortgages, whether to enter into a fixed rate or a variable tracker. In this example for the calculation, I've taken a 5-year fixed rate mortgage over a 30-year term, which is currently around 4.3% interest. That would mean a monthly mortgage payment of £1,472. At the start of the mortgage, £1,058 of the total monthly payment is interest paid to the bank, and £414 is paying down the loan amount and increasing your equity in the property. Over time, the amount of interest paid each month will come down as the cost of debt changes. To get an idea of what the monthly mortgage payments would be for your own personal circumstances, you can compare mortgage rates using a comparison website for the country that you're based in. The third cost is property taxes and completion costs. In the UK, homebuyers have to pay stamp duty tax. You can see the current rates here for this financial year, and you can also find them on the government website. However, it's worth noting that the rates are planned to change from the 1st of April 2025. In the example of purchasing a house worth £350,000, if it was completed before the end of March 2025, then between £250,000 and £350,000 stamp duty tax would apply. So 5% on £100,000 would be £5,000 of tax. But if the house purchase was completed after the 1st of April 2025, then stamp duty tax would be higher at £7,500. On top of this, also part of completion costs are solicitor and survey fees, which are typically around £1,500 to £2,000 for this type of property. And the fourth cost to consider is maintenance costs. Experts suggest to set aside around 1% of the property's value per year for any maintenance and repair costs for the property. So for this example, it would be to budget £3,500 per year for maintenance. The next thing you want to consider is the opportunity cost, and this is something that not many people actually consider when evaluating whether to buy or to rent a property. If I'm choosing to buy, then in most cities you would expect that over the long term house prices will rise. Savills, the property services company, forecasts that over the next 5 years house prices in the UK will increase by between 2.5% and 5% per year. If house prices were to increase by the lower end of that estimate at around 3% annually, that would mean that the £350,000 property would be worth over £405,000 after 5 years. So you would make £55,000 if you were able to sell for that price. But if you're letting go of the money for the deposit amount and other upfront costs associated with buying a property, you're also letting go of the opportunity to use that money to invest in another wealth generating asset. For example, you could invest in the S&P 500 stock market, which has seen average annual returns of around 7 to 8% over the last 30 years. If you were able to invest the £52,500 deposit amount at a 7% annual rate of return, then you could be looking at a total investment value of over £73,000 after 5 years, so just over £21,000 of investment profit. There are many variables which come into play here which can impact both the house appreciation and the investment calculations. For example, how long will you stay in your home? What will the housing market be like at the time that you sell? And which part of the country are you planning to buy in? No one definitively knows what the situation will be like in the coming years, but what you can do is model the cost based on assumptions for your own circumstances for both buying and renting so that you can compare. You can also use a rent versus buy calculator online to help you with the comparison. To show you an example, I'll use the same parameters that I shared earlier in the video and input this information. So buying a house for £350,000, putting down a deposit of 15%, mortgage interest at 4.3% over a 30-year term, 1% for annual maintenance costs, average home appreciation of 3% per year and 1% for buying and selling costs, versus renting a house for £1,650 per month, which increases with 3% inflation, and using the deposit amount of £52,500 to invest based on a 7% annual rate of return over 5 years. If you run the numbers on both scenarios, then in this example, buying the house would have been better financially than renting. However, although you'd be better off by over £50,000 by buying, both buying and renting actually come out with net losses after 5 years. But if you lived in the property for a longer period of time, based on these parameters, buying a property would start to turn into a net profit. This is because of the high initial interest payments and high upfront costs associated with buying a property, but if this is spread over a longer period of time, then the house appreciation turns this into a net gain. In this 5-year example, you would need over 17% annual return on investment before renting becomes better financially than buying. These calculations are based on a number of variables and assumptions. For example, if interest rates were higher, then buying would have been less favourable. If the time period was less than 5 years, then renting would have been more comparable to buying. And if houses depreciated over 5 years, then renting would have been the better financial option. It really depends on your situation and when you think is the right time to buy or sell, so I recommend running the numbers based on your own personal circumstances. When comparing whether to buy or rent, it's important to consider both financial and non-financial considerations. Some of the pros of renting are you don't have large upfront costs like stamp duty and a house deposit. You don't have ongoing maintenance costs. If an appliance breaks through general wear and tear, it's the landlord's responsibility to fix it. You don't have the concern or risk of house depreciation and the market going down and losing your wealth invested in the property. And renting is more flexible as you can just give notice and leave rather than spending months and months trying to sell your property. However, some of the cons of renting are that all the money that you spend on rent payments goes to the landlord rather than paying down equity on a property that you own. The landlord has control. They could give notice and you have to move out of the property. They could give notice to increase the rent that you pay each month. And normally you have no or limited freedom to customize the property to your wants, as you don't own it. If we look now at buying and owning a property, some of the pros are that long-term house ownership has historically proven to be a resilient investment. As long as you aren't forced to sell during a market downturn, then house appreciation can be a great way to grow your wealth. It gives you freedom to change the property as you want, for example, to extend the property, to put a new kitchen in, or to change the decoration. It can also give you peace of mind. You own the property, so as long as you can keep up with the mortgage payments, you can stay in the property for as long as you like. Unlike renting, you don't have the concern of a landlord giving you notice to move out. Some of the cons to consider of buying a property are the large upfront costs and the fact that your money is locked away in the property. I spoke about this earlier in the video, as there's an opportunity cost of using that money to invest in the stock market or another wealth generating asset. As a property owner, you have full ownership, but with that you have the hassle and cost of maintenance, and when the time comes to sell, it can take a long time to go through the sale process. There is also a risk of market downturn. House prices could fall, and if you had to sell at this time, then you could lose the money that you had invested in the property. Overall, I look at property investing with a long-term mindset, and generally speaking, if you zoom out and look at house prices over the long term, there's been an upward trajectory with some ups and downs along the way, but it can be a good way to build your personal wealth. Hopefully this video helps you with some of the key considerations when making a decision on whether to buy or to rent a property. Feel free to leave any comments, give the video a like and subscribe to my channel. I'll see you on the next video.